The interesting thing about the modular narrative is there's a little bit of it's a little bit of marketing, right? Like if you actually look in the code of many of the chains, like it's like what does modular mean? Like Linea is as modular as any of these other chains. Most optimistic rollups aren't even doing the optimistic rollup part. Okay, it's it's literally there is no mechanism for anyone to report fraud. You are literally trusting a system of centralized actors that your transactions are safe. So, I mean, in terms of activities, ZKs are already flipped. Optimistic rollups. I think
Really?
ZK Sync here is the largest rollup in the last 30 days by transactions, which is another ZK rollup. So,
Yeah, but the trick there is teasing the airdrop, right?
yeah, to be fair, it's a little bit like PvP right now.
I'd like to welcome our guest, Declan, who is let me see if I get the title right. Product manager at Linea. Is that the correct title?
That's good enough.
Okay. Welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me.
How you doing? Where are you calling in from?
Doing good. Calling in from, well, just outside of London today, but UK. So yeah, nice to meet you all.
Awesome. We're happy to have you. A lot of our community is really engaged on chain and always looking for the best opportunities. I think over the last year and a half, there's been a big migration away from alt L1s and towards L2s. And if I look on DeFi Llama, I can see that Linea is one of the faster growing L2s. It might be a little bit of a dark horse, but it seems to be growing as of late. So can you briefly introduce Linea and its relationship with Consensys and what you guys are all about?
Yeah, sure. So Linea is a layer two. So I'm kind of, I'm not sure what everyone's like technical understanding here. So, let me know if I'm saying things that everyone understands already. But Linea is a layer two, which uses Ethereum for its security and liveness. It uses zero knowledge technology, zero knowledge proofs for its scalability. So we're able to sort of scale Ethereum while still inheriting its security and decentralization. So that's obviously great for many reasons, including DeFi. It's a project that has been incubated by Consensys. Okay, so Consensys, has been around since the very beginning of Ethereum. The founder of Consensys is also the co-founder of, the Ethereum protocol itself, right? Joe Lubin. So Ethereum is kind of like runs in the DNA and the bloodline of Consensys, and Consensys has always been supporting the Ethereum roadmap. So some other projects or public goods that Consensys has produced includes Hyperledger Besu, which is the third largest execution client, Teku, which is the Consensys client as part of the merge. So really heavily involved with the L1 protocol. And then obviously, MetaMask itself, which is, well, there's still the leading Web3 wallet in the space, and MetaMask institutional as well, if you've used that as sort of like more, it provides a little bit more additional functionality for institutions when using MetaMask. And so Linea is just sort of the next logical step and progression of that support for Ethereum by Consensys. So we've put a lot of resources and time into creating this technology and launching the mainnet. So we are actually live on mainnet today, as you mentioned, where we've been around for 3 months now on mainnet. So yeah, it's been a long journey to get here, which I'm sure we can dive into. But we're live and kicking now on mainnet. We're actually using zero knowledge proofs today. So the technology is there to secure you in any transaction and inherit the security of Ethereum. And it's being incubated by Consensys, but the idea is that it will be a decentralized protocol that is part of a much larger ecosystem of players than Consensys. We're just sort of getting this thing off the ground and then passing it on to the community.
Yeah, great summary. I think that the average technical understanding in this crowd, it's a wide range, but everybody here has been around in the industry for the most part for a while, and kind of at least survived so far through the bear cycle. So I wouldn't say there's any like total noobs. So I think most people understood most of what you just said. So do you think that Consensys is specialty and experience in contributing to the development of I think you said consensus and execution clients on Ethereum gives Linea a advantage from like in the roll up in the L2 space?
Yeah, I think so, absolutely. And we're seeing this today practically because, the part of the Linea blockchain that actually builds blocks and executes transactions, which is this client called Besu. It's the same client that's been on Ethereum. Okay, so like we're already reusing the same software, and we have that team who's built the software in-house who's working with our team. So all that experience from like building the Ethereum protocol is now being leveraged to build a more scalable version of Ethereum. So we're like very, very practically seeing the benefits of that. And like what that ultimately means is that we're just going to be able to offer faster transactions, cheaper transactions, and that's kind of what users are after, right? Also still whilst inheriting the security of Ethereum. So it's yeah, we're already seeing the benefit there. And when we actually look to decentralize as well, then like leveraging Teku, which is a consensus client. So the same thing just happening again. And like all those years of battle testing and building blocks on L1 on layer 1, we can like just basically like port that and reuse it on layer 2. Whereas nearly every other rollup has to build from scratch, which is a huge disadvantage.
By build from scratch, I mean the consensus and execution clients for Ethereum are open source, right? So do they really have to build from scratch? Can you describe exactly why the familiarity with that technology gives Linea an advantage?
Yeah. So basically with what other teams have done is they've kind of started from scratch to build an execution client. And that's because everyone's prover is different. So how the ZK rollup works, like Linea and other ZK rollups, is you have a block builder, they basically take some transactions, they process it, very much the same you'll get on any other blockchain. And then there's this piece that actually says, right, I can see what transactions you're trying to like update the database from one state to another, and I'm going to be able to prove that and then send that sort of information, a receipt to someone else who can say, yeah, okay, I agree with you. And it's that second part, that prover part, that really relies on the execution client. And so if you can't, even though it's open source, it's you still have to modify it somewhat. And so what we're able to do, because we work with the team's internal consensus, is we're able to modify them more towards what the linear prover is. So that's where the difference is. Over time, in the very long term, this should be a common standard, which is the EVM that every team will apply to. But we're talking like 5 to 10 years, I would say. And that's actually when we can start dropping in the technology that we're building into Ethereum itself. So this is like the super, super long term. But eventually all the work that we're doing at Linea, we can take that and then we can, replace the Ethereum layer 1 execution shards with Linea ZK EVM software to prove Ethereum blocks directly. And like that's a pretty cool state. And the reason I say it's a cool state is because all of a sudden now you can have like one shard on Ethereum. So like one client can basically prove hundreds of thousands of transactions. And then you can distribute that to a network and they don't need to re-execute transactions. They can just, verify the proof. So it's great for decentralization, great for scalability.
Okay, great. And I think we'll get to that in a second. I know a lot of people have questions regarding ZK rollups versus optimistic rollups. From most people here, our perspective is that optimistic rollups have been kind of dominating the scene for DeFi products, for maybe on-chain games, everything that is a user app that people want to engage with. Most of that activity has occurred and grown on optimistic rollups so far, like Arbitrum, Optimism, and more recently Base. So can you briefly explain the difference between optimistic rollups and ZK rollups for somebody who maybe knows that they're both L2s but doesn't understand the difference?
Yeah, sure. So the biggest difference comes down to security and your security assumptions. So when you're using a ZK rollup like Linea, your security assumption is on cryptography. So you're trusting almost like maths, basically. Whereas when you're using an optimistic rollup, you're trusting crypto economics. So you're back to trusting people, like third parties and like, game theory. And that really is the fundamental difference. And to double dive into that, so how, when you're using an optimistic rollup, how it actually works is you have this blockchain, it's doing a bunch of computation. So it's taking transactions, it's updating the database to a new version. And then what you need to do with a rollup is you need to then post that update back to Ethereum so it can verify it. Okay, and that's kind of like where the whole like rolling up part is. You like roll up a bunch of transactions and you submit that batch to Ethereum. And with an optimistic rollup, you're basically optimistically assuming that that update is like valid. Okay, it's kind of like, hey, like trust me, like it's, I updated it, just trust me. And so what happens with an optimistic rollup is you have these third parties, like almost like watchmen, and they're looking at these updates and they're saying, okay, well, I'm going to also do the computation just to check. And so what the whole game theory part works is that if I'm watching and I say, hey, like you submitted this update and actually it's wrong, like you're trying to double spend or do something funky, then I could submit a challenge. And you get into this whole like back and forth challenge game. And if I'm right, then you get slashed and I get your money. It's very, very complicated. Whereas in a ZK rollup, it's almost like a pessimistic rollup, right? So I'm sending you this database update to the L1, but I'm not saying like, trust me, or let's introduce another actor to catch me out. I'm like providing you a zero knowledge proof. And that immediately validates it, right? If that proof is valid, then the state update is valid without having to do any of the computation yourself. And that is like literally the fundamental reason of the main differences. And even today's system. So Linea, for example, every transaction, every batch that gets processed on Linea, we send that data to Ethereum alongside a zero knowledge proof. Okay, that's happening today in mainnet. Most optimistic rollups aren't even doing the optimistic rollup part. Okay, it's literally, there is no mechanism for anyone to report fraud. You are literally trusting a system of centralized actors that your transactions are safe. And I think for DeFi, that is very, very shaky foundations to be on long term. And I think ultimately most optimistic rollups will eventually look very much like ZK rollups as they sort of evolve over time with the technology. But to be fair, like optimistic rollups are a sort of temporary milestone in a longer journey. Like there was a need to scale and they were more simpler to build. It's good that we moved things to optimistic rollups rather than other centralized layer ones. So from that perspective, they've served their purpose, but ZK is here and it's live and kicking, and now's the time to get on board with zero knowledge.
Okay, awesome. So kind of in summary, optimistic rollups are relying on game theory, right? And ZK rollups are relying on math.
Yeah.
To settle
Trust
for the L1.
maths, not validators, basically.
Yeah. Would you say that maybe ZK rollups fumbled the bag in their naming and their marketing by not branding as pessimistic rollups?
Well, yeah, it's interesting. I think like the marketing team would be like, pessimistic's too negative, and maybe it is, but like as a direct, comparison, something that I really like is like realistic rollup. Like Linea is a realistic rollup. From that sense, so we're realistic about what we can prove and what we can't, and our trust assumptions. We're not trying to fool anyone. And the security assumptions are much better than optimistic. So that is one potential direction. So interestingly as well, because they're called a ZK rollup, right, which stands for zero knowledge, and zero knowledge typically means like I hide something from you, like it's private. But no ZK rollups today actually are private. Like we're using zero knowledge for scalability, not privacy. So that's like an actual like common misconception. And you can tell when anyone's written a ChatGPT article, because ChatGPT will tell you they're private and then they always get it wrong. And I'm like, oh, where'd you get that one from? So yeah, ZK rollups are probably the wrong name. I think validity rollups is like the technically right name, but again, doesn't sound as good, does it? So
yeah, definitely validity rollup is a little bit too cumbersome for the marketing team probably. Earlier you mentioned that ZK rollups, correct me if I'm wrong, you said are faster and cheaper than optimistic rollups. I definitely can see how they're faster because it doesn't rely on that challenge period in order to get data settled to Ethereum and to basically have it, I guess, fully settled and assured. But can they really ever be cheaper? And from a user perspective, is it going to be possible to compete on price and user experience, or do you think there'll be some other catalyst that causes ZK solutions to ultimately flip the optimistic rollups that we have today?
They can definitely compete on price. And the reason for that is that the fixed cost for a ZK rollup is higher. Okay, because you're sending this proof, and to verify this proof on Ethereum costs gas. And you need to send a proof for like every batch of transactions you're posting. Whereas an optimistic rollup, remember, we're just like optimistically assuming everything's okay. So I'm not actually submitting any proof. Like I'm just like, cool, like here's my update. So the fixed cost is higher. However, because of the way this game theory works on the optimistic rollup, you need to provide all of the information about the transactions when you're publishing the database. So you're actually providing more like variable cost per transaction. Whereas on a ZK rollup, you can emit as much data as possible and like compress, almost like minifying a file to its like very like core, and then you send that. So the variable cost per transaction is lower on ZK, and you can see the payback period like over time. You know, as we get to a certain level of TPS, you know, ZK will just become cheaper to operate as like a system, and therefore the price can be cheaper because you can pass that cost saving on to your users. Now the TPS and like the demand for block space today is like still really low. Like it's a drop in the ocean compared to where we hope to go. But like in the future, the ZK systems will be cheaper, they'll be faster. Technically, like they can be as, optimistic could be as fast as ZK because it's down to execution. Like it's just old school processing of transactions, and that doesn't actually include any of the ZK part. The ZK will always be more secure. So it becomes a question of like, do you want more secure and cheaper transactions? Right. And I think for some use cases like DeFi, that's an obvious yes. I think the other interesting catalyst for why ZK will overtake optimistic rollups is because of this game theory requires time to play out. This back and forth, like, oh, I'm submitting a challenge, and we usually have to wait around 7 days or 1 week for that whole process to play out, which is why if you withdraw through an optimistic rollup bridge, like if you try and withdraw from Optimism to Ethereum, not using a third-party bridge, but using their bridge, it takes 7 days. Whereas using Linea, it'll take minutes, right? And that's because of the integrity. And the interesting thing there is that it's like, if you think of blockchains almost like cities or countries, right? And bridges are like this sort of, transfer of like financial capital markets. Like we've seen that like capital markets should have loose, financial controls, like generally get more liquidity. So just the capital efficiency across these systems is going to be much smoother across ZK. Like you can move from one city to another in minutes rather than a week. We're just going to see liquidity naturally be more attracted to ZK over time.
Yeah, you brought up a good point that if you use the main bridges of these optimistic rollups, you have that period where you have to wait to withdraw. But from a user's current perspective, you don't really see that if you use a third-party bridge or maybe withdraw from optimistic layer 2 to an exchange. Can you describe maybe like how the optimistic rollups are avoiding that challenge period if you're using a third-party bridge, and then just highlight why that doesn't exist briefly for ZK rollups?
Yeah, so when you're using a third party, by definition, you're introducing another set of actors. So introducing another set of additional trust assumptions. Okay, so how third party bridges usually work is they'll have like their own set of validator nodes. Okay, and those validator nodes will secure a certain amount of like TVL or collateral, and they're the ones that are signing those cross-chain transactions or using their own liquidity pools to manage assets between different bridges, between different chains. So you're not using the native messaging services of the blockchains themselves. You're using this like external, almost like broker. Okay. And depending on which broker you use, like some of them can be completely centralized. I mean, how many bridge hacks have they been? None of them are native bridges. They're all these third-party ones which introduce new risks. So you can use those if you want. And sure, you can get a fast transaction to another chain. But you're taking on more risk, whereas you can get the same fast property with a ZK without that additional risk. That's kind of like the main difference, I would say.
Yeah. So that's a great point. But still with ZK rollups, is there a larger risk before they become Lindy, before they sort of get hardened over time? Is there somewhat of a risk because of the newness of these ZK rollups, or is there like a larger attack surface because these are somewhat new solutions with maybe, I assume, some new code being introduced in order to develop them? Am I kind of right in assuming that?
So you're right in assuming that there is like still an attack surface there. Like ultimately, when you're trusting maths, you need to make sure that the maths is correct. There's good ways to make sure maths is correct, like formal verification, general like auditing processes. There's also increasing the diversity of proofs that are being generated. So this is something that we're going to be doing. So something that Linea will have is what we call the multi-prover. And it solves this exact problem, right? This problem of like, oh, if there's a bug in one, then what happens? So the multi-prover, each update to this database, each set of transactions that comes in, like each block, will have multiple diverse implementations of a zero knowledge prover generating a proof. So there can be like 3 proofs per batch. Okay. And that means that if there's a bug in the cryptography or the maths of one, then as long as the other 2, which are diverse, are like still valid, then your transaction is safe. And this is like way, way, way more secure than anything out there today. This is actually one of the reasons why Ethereum has been so successful, because there's, I think, like 8 or 9 different clients. You know, I mentioned it earlier, the Consensys has built the 3rd largest one, basically. But you've got Geth, you've got Nevermind, you've got some other ones. And because there's so many different ones, the merge happened, right? If there's a bug in one, the network still continues. And so we're going to replicate the same thing on layer 2. So again, if there's a bug in the cryptography, which can happen, you know, we're going to be a ZK EVM, which follows the Ethereum spec, and that's going to be continuously updated. We're going to need more audits, more formal verification, but we're safe because, well, if there's a bug in one, then we've got at least 2 others. But now we can start to experiment as well with like faster provers, because we know that if this is a little bit higher risk, there's like way more redundancy and diversity. So yeah, that's where we're heading.
Awesome. Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. We talk a lot here in our community about security and layers. And so redundancy is kind of a big part of that, right? If you're looking at that sort of similar concept from a personal user security perspective, we talk about using a hardware wallet to secure your seed phrase, but also having multiple addresses so everything's not on one address, and also knowing every contract that you're interacting with and what exactly you're signing, so that if one part goes wrong, right, if there's one hole in your security, you're not totally wrecked because you have redundancy, right? You've got security in layers. So I think that's important, not just from a personal user perspective, but from a infrastructure perspective as well. Makes sense. For everyone in the audience, I know that we're hitting on some technical topics, and I'm sure a lot of people are itching to get to like what's going on with Linea and the application ecosystem, and I promise we'll get to that in a second. I did want to just lay a good foundation to give like context into everything that's happening kind of in the Ethereum ecosystem and in the zero knowledge space, so that when we get to the goodies, we're primed. So as far as like timelines for the adoption of ZK environments over optimistic environments, or when the users and devs will be like predominantly building on ZK type environments, and that flippening will occur, do you have like a timeline or a guess on how long that could take? Are we talking like months, quarters, or like 2 years? And will like EIP 4844 play into this at all, or not really?
I think 4844 will have similar benefits across the board. Like whether you're an optimistic rollup or a ZK rollup, you're leveraging, if you're a full rollup, you're leveraging Ethereum for data availability, and 4844 reduces that data availability cost. So everyone's prices should drop across the board. 4844 is the sort of like the EIP code given to the Ethereum protocol upgrade. It's also called proto dank sharding. We're not very good at naming things, I believe. But basically the way to think about it is rollups are great secure solutions because they give you this scalability, this really this computation which makes things cheaper and faster, but they're still inheriting security from Ethereum. And almost that property of inheriting security from Ethereum costs. Like you're buying that security from Ethereum. And today it's really expensive, so that cost gets passed on to users. And with 4844, Ethereum's going to make it really cheap for rollups to leverage their security. And then the idea is that cost saving will be passed on to users of platforms like Linea. So everything should drop in terms of price. I think the ZK will realistically flip optimistic in the next bull market, because that's when we'll see a new like surge of like liquidity and TVL. It depends what you mean, like flip by what really. But if you think like the traditional KPIs like TVL, I mean, in terms of activity, ZK's already flipped, optimistic rollups. I think
Really?
ZK Syncera is the largest rollup in the last 30 days by transactions, which is another ZK rollup.
So, yeah, but the trick there is teasing the airdrop, right?
Yeah, to be fair, it's a little bit like PvP right now.
Yeah.
So yeah, when there's like new set of users and use cases and liquidity comes in, I think we'll see more and more, especially in DeFi, attracted to ZK again because of those properties of security, because of the capital efficiency of the bridge and the fast settlement times. Like a lot of serious investors, look at these things, not just from a DGEM perspective, but like, oh, I'm going to actually put like my client's money or my own, assets on chain. I'm going to do some due diligence. And I think that's when we'll see a bit of a flippening. But interestingly, it almost won't even be a flippening because I expect the optimistic rollups to probably try and attempt the hefty migration to ZK at some point anyway. And as I said at the beginning, like most optimistic rollups today aren't actually optimistic rollups. They're just pretending. So
yeah,
it could be a whole psyops anyway.
So is that, and that's something I've considered before, right? Like theoretically, I've seen on like Optimism's roadmap that the OP stack could one day be, zero knowledge proof based. Is that really possible to have that level of sort of infrastructure overhaul on something that's live? I mean, we kind of saw it with the merge in Shanghai, but do you think that optimistic rollups like Arbitrum and Optimism could pull off such a major switch in how their technology works? And would that not like scare all the users to death? I mean, I know everybody was a little nervous during the merge, but there's all that redundancy in the Ethereum network. Like you mentioned earlier, there's plenty of execution clients and Consensys clients running on the Ethereum network. And so like with Shanghai, I remember we did see kind of a little significant hiccup during that upgrade process, but because of the diverse client network, it wasn't it wasn't a mortal wound, right? But do you really think that optimistic rollups could pull that off without scaring all of their users away in the weeks and months before such a process?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely feasible, but really challenging. And like you mentioned, it's challenging technically, but it's challenging from like a coordination perspective. The merge just took many, many years of, preparing on the coordination side. And when you do introduce multiple clients, again, that's the social level coordination, which isn't the easiest problem to solve, as humans have proved out many times over humanity's history. So I think it's inevitable though. Like it's, and I think they will switch at some point. But again, it brings risk with it, and it probably takes time. And there's always going to be, as anyone who's been in like a sort of large organization, does digital transformation, like going from legacy tech to modern day tech, is not an easy thing. Okay, there's always going to be hiccups, and I think those are the problems that they'll need to solve when and if they do it.
Yeah, makes sense. So yeah, in summary, possible, very difficult, probably relies on social coordination and really superb memes. So you've got to get the memes on point before you can coordinate such a technical overhaul. Okay. I want to pivot a little bit and talk about EVM equivalence. We've seen, recently there was like that maker proposal. It's like, hey, we build our backend on a Solana fork. I think that there's been talks about Solana style rollups, Solana virtual machine. Is it SVM? Do people say that? I don't know. Sort of rollups. What's the benefit of being EVM equivalent versus the drawbacks? And first of all, what is EVM equivalence? What's the benefits and drawbacks? And what's Linea's approach?
Yeah. So EVM equivalence, which again probably isn't the best named thing, is basically so Linea. Well, so EVM equivalent rollups are blockchains which have an execution environment, and if your execution environment is as compatible as the bytecode of Ethereum itself, then you are EVM equivalent. Okay. So from a developer's perspective, using Ethereum, building on Ethereum would be exactly the same as building on a EVM equivalent ZK rollup, also commonly referred to as a ZK EVM. And that's obviously great for many reasons. Like the two biggest ones are, first, if you've already got an application and you're wanting to go multi-chain, or you're wanting to get that scalability properly, like, you know, Uniswap, for example, right, like big on Ethereum, can deploy on something like Linea in just like minutes, because it's exactly the same. You don't have to rewrite your code. You're maintaining the same software, the same code. You're using the same tools. You're using MetaMask, using Infura, using Hard Hat, Foundry, whatever you have in your tooling stack. It's exactly the same. You don't need to re-audit anything, right? Because you're not changing any lines. You need to like hire any auditor and have to manage different parts. So it's just essentially exactly the same. So that's great if you have an existing dApp and you're looking to move multi-chain. But it's also good if you're just like what we see is a lot of like Solidity, which is the programming language of the EVM, is the most adopted language right now in crypto and Web3. And many developers are familiar with Ethereum. So just like if you're looking to build a new dApp, do you want to have to learn another domain-specific language? Like, you know, it's just, why add more hurdles into what is already a very complicated developer process? So it's really just good for like finding product market fit, because you can focus on like building new use cases rather than learning a new tool stack. So that's the second reason it's really good to be EVM equivalent. There are different levels of like ZK EVM. So the Linea is the most compatible ZK EVM, so developer experience is exactly the same as Ethereum. But there are some ZK EVMs, something like ZK Sync, for example, where it's actually very different. So like, sure, you can build a Solidity contract, but the compiler is different compiler to Ethereum. Like Linea has the exact same compiler, whereas ZK Sync is different. And you can get into all sort of like funky nuances there. One particular one I remember was like one team like tried to use a transfer function they raised like some money on a project, and then they wanted to be able to transfer the money that they raised, and the function worked differently to Ethereum. So the funds were stuck and it was like millions of dollars, right? And it's just these sorts of things that is like an extra headache as a developer you got to think about. So making sure that you're on like a ZK EVM like Linea is like super important for developers. And yeah, and then you can, what are the downsides, right? So the upsides is that you get to leverage the network effects of the Ethereum ecosystem, like all the tooling, all the developers, all the projects and the dApps. I guess the downside is that you're doing EVM, and like there are different ways to build applications today. Like you mentioned Solana, the Solana virtual machine uses parallelization and multi-threading and whatnot. Like, you can potentially build applications that have, rely on higher throughput, and you can do that today. Like, I think if the EVM can be improved over time, and it will be, the SVM can do more transactions today. So the difficult part of that is it's a smaller ecosystem. Okay, and you're not able to leverage the existing tooling. So it's all trade-offs, right? And as a developer, the good thing is rollups, so you get to sort of like choose from this smorgasbord of trade-offs.
Okay, so I've a little bit of pushback, right? So I'm fairly sure like a lot more Rust developers in the world than there are Solidity developers, right? So like, is there an argument to be made that having a ZK rollup or Validium environment with a Rust or SVM sort of execution layer, if I'm using all that technical terminology right, feel free to correct me, could that be a potential future? And is it also possible for these solutions to like live in harmony, like to have an EVM equivalent or many EVM equivalent roll-up solutions, and also have other environments where developers can build applications that ultimately use Ethereum for data settlement or availability, but maybe offer a different experience to developers in that ecosystem.
Yeah, I definitely expect there to be multiple rollups. I think we'll see many rollups. I think we'll see a handful of more universal rollups, which leverage the composability aspect of the blockchain, right? Like the money Legos building on top of each other, the shared state, where you can maybe have DeFi and gaming, gamify, socialify all on one chain. And then like a sort of long tail of almost like rollups, which are like serving one application, or like app chains, you could think of them. Kind of similar to how the web works. And I think in terms of those execution environments, we'll see so much for EVM, because EVM is here to stay. The Ethereum layer 1 is like the biggest smart contract platform, and it uses the EVM, it uses Solidity, it's not going anywhere. So as a roll-up, it's a very, very safe bet on that ecosystem. And I do think we'll see like different programming languages and different execution environments, like Solana, maybe like Starknet and Cairo. You mentioned like with Solana, it uses Rust, but because of the nuances of the blockchain, it's actually a very stripped back version of Rust. It's almost not Rust, like when you get into it. And that's because like there's just so much nuance of distributed systems that when you actually, get into these languages, you can't have a general purpose language because you need the guardrails. At a previous company, I actually tried to build a domain specific language. So I know exactly like it was sort of like a stripped down version of Go, and we ended up with like Lisp. It was, it's difficult to have a general purpose language on the blockchain. So Solidity is the biggest domain specific language, and it's probably going to stay that way for at least the short to midterm.
Yeah. When we were at Permissionless, you blew my mind with this concept of Ethereum as the shared data layer where multiple different rollups could access that data sort of interoperably in somewhat real time. So we definitely see in DeFi today, like if I'm on Ethereum and I have an LP token in Uniswap or Curve, and there is a borrowing and lending market that utilizes that LP token as collateral, I can maybe deposit that LP token as a collateral asset and borrow stable coins against it, right? And so there I have two different applications that are interoperable permissionlessly because they're both built on the same blockchain. And that interoperability extends to L2s, but it's isolated, right? Like I can use for example, on Arbitrum, there is a liquidity position for the biggest application there, GMX, called GLP. And we've all seen over the last year and a half, many projects spring up that create interoperability between their project and GLP, because it's like a really popular asset for people to hold, get leverage on, collateralize, whatever. So you see these money Legos, right? Is there a future where those money Legos can securely operate and stack on top of each other across rollups? And if so, how?
Technically, yes, but it's still a research question. And the reason that you can think about doing this sort of setup is because of the magic of zero knowledge proofs. So if you remember earlier, one of the cool things about using zero knowledge technology is I'm able to do a bunch of computation like on my blockchain or my database, and I'm able to generate a proof of that computation and then send that proof to someone else who can verify it immediately. Okay, so if you can generate that proof inside the time it takes to build a block, and then verify that on a shared layer, let's say like something like Ethereum, right, where many rollups are anchored into the same root of trust, then if you can actually verify that, hey, like the state of this database, I can trust that it's like, with the zero knowledge proof on Ethereum, I can trust what the latest state is, then I can start to get into levels of, atomic like cross-chain transactions, right? So in the same block, I can say, hey, like if the trade on this side happens, then I'm going to execute the trade on my side. So you get the same properties of like atomic, synchronous communication that you get on a shared state machine, but you're on a different, like roll up a different blockchain. And then you can customize like, oh, I want this blockchain to be zero gas fees, or like have fast blocks, or be private, or do all sorts of things you might want to customize. And it's, as an analogy, the way you can think about it is very similar to how the sort of orchestration of the web works today with different servers. Like we have many web servers. We started off with the mainframe, then we went to cloud computing. Nowadays, you have like orchestration where you spin up like virtualization of blockchains, Dockerized, containers, and it's going to look very, very similar on the long tail, right? Where like I have an application, it's going to have like a big peak of demand. Maybe it's like a game that does a launch, right? Like a new launch of a game always has big peaks of demand. I'm going to do this on a chain, and then I'm going to be able to verify the game state on another chain where the NFTs might be traded. And like to do that all in the space of one block is going to be like feel pretty seamless to the user. So this is where we're heading in the very, very, there's a lot of steps to get there for sure. But that's the sort of what the end state could look like for like multi-chain blockchains.
A lot of great conversations. I have more technical questions to ask about the prover network, about protocol enshrinement. I'm sure you read that Vitalik thing that came out not too long ago, but I don't want to go over time without talking about Linea. So can you tell me from like a DeFi perspective, from a user's perspective, why should we bridge to Linea now? Are there any applications you're excited about? I saw there's something called the Linea Voyage going on. Can we get in on that? Tell me about Linea DeFi and why we should bridge.
Yeah. So first there's lots happening on DeFi. DeFi is our biggest vertical on Linea. And there's two reasons why we're seeing a lot of developers come to Linea. One is the security reason I mentioned. Like people see ZK as the future for security, and if you're DeFi, like that's a big concern. Like more of a concern than like a gaming app who might not really care if their sort of Elrond, like eventually gets like misrepresented or whatever. And the second thing is that it's simple. Okay, so like I mentioned, Linea is being bootstrapped by Consensys. Consensys also operates the largest wallet in Web3, MetaMask, the little fox that you use to interact with DeFi. Combining the two, you can create such a simple and seamless experience. And we're starting to see that now. Like if you open up your MetaMask wallet, you'll see Linea there today. That's just like the very first stepping stone. We're going to see with account abstraction, like this amazing experience where you don't even really know you're using the chain, right? You're just interacting with dApps, like how it should be, right? You use the internet, you don't really care if Facebook uses AWS or Azure, you just use that. So it's going to be simple and it's going to be secure, which is great for DeFi. It's great for payments. In terms of the applications that we're seeing and the activations we're doing, so we have this voyage thing you mentioned. So the voyage, the voyage is we've got multiple voyages. Okay, and the one that's most interesting is the one that's coming up, which is the DeFi voyage. That's coming up at the end of this month. And so the DeFi voyage is a way to introduce our entire community to all the different DeFi apps that are on Linea. And that's across every single like DeFi, vertical you can imagine, whether it's like perps or, money markets, dexes. And we're sort of introducing the community to become like essentially degens, right? Or like make it really, really easy for them to know how to use DeFi, to use many of the different applications. We're going to try and showcase, I think, 80 applications during the DeFi festival. And then what you do as a user is you get to receive these Voyage XP tokens when you interact with dApps. Okay, so these Voyage XP, they're actual tokens that you receive, and you can build over time. So the more you use the protocols, the more XP tokens you receive. And then we're sort of figuring out ways to give more utility to these Voyage XP tokens. Okay, so actually like engaging the community over time, there's going to be like ways, you can imagine like discounts on certain things, and, you actually be able to like participate in like the direction of the protocol, like provide your feedback. And it's like a real way to like make sure the community grows with Linea. So that is the voyage, and the reason for the name, right? It's a voyage. Like we acknowledge, like I say, we're a realistic rollup. We acknowledge that, we're a certain place today. We're on a long journey. We're on a voyage to where we want to get to, that super secure, seamless, world. And we want the community to come with us. So that's kind of like where the whole, voyage and XP and DeFi bit comes in.
Yeah, I definitely think you've probably won a few fans with that vision of the future. So that's super cool. I like the name. Is there any like one or two or three, however many applications that you are really excited about that maybe are featured on this Linea voyage that we should be keeping in mind to make sure that we use?
Yeah, I would say Mendy Finance. The team are really great. They're sort of borrowing and lending, solid team, well backed, really focused on the sort of user experience, and like care about their community as well. Like all the things that I think are like, you know, the if you're looking to be a founder in Web3, like as an adapt player, like those are the kind of things you want to tick off in terms of what your focus is. So I really recommend Mendy Finance. I mean, I don't want to like single out too many people because, you know, there's actually like so many. We do have a bunch of the blue chips as well. So like, you know, there's your like sushis, your pancakes, your unis, all that kind of stuff. And like more coming as well. But you know, there's a lot of like new native protocols, which I'm personally more excited about because, you know, we're trying to push the space forward and do like new stuff and leverage the scalability, like not just necessarily like port over existing things. So yeah, I won't give any more off, but there's lots more in like almost every segment. And again, I think people, you know, people are really excited because they believe that the sort of vision around like that simple user experience, the onboarding of the next wave of Web3 is going to happen through the wallet, and it's going to happen on Linea. Like it's almost like the gateway to DeFi. It's the gateway to your onboarding, your Web3 experience. So we're really excited about that. And yeah, and if you want to find out any more information about the voyage as well, we released a couple of blog posts now. So Voyage XP is the sort of token system, which I really recommend checking out. This is quite novel. No one's really done this sort of thing yet in the Web3 space, like had this sort of level of community engagement. And then Linea Voyage as well. And the DeFi Voyage is the one that's coming up soon, which you should definitely pay attention to. It's going to be really, really good.
And that's at the end of this month. So it's October 2023, if anybody's watching the recording. So the end of this month around is when the DeFi Voyage is going to start.
Yeah, it's either end of this month or beginning of next month. It's around then.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Cool. And I've got to ask, because it's the rules. I don't make the rules, but I gotta ask. So these XP tokens, they're governance tokens. When is there liquidity pools available for these governance tokens? When is there going to be an airdrop? What's your philosophy on the airdrop? You can deflect the question if you'd like, but it is my duty to ask it.
Well, I can talk to the XP tokens because you know, that's something that we've published on. So the XP tokens, they will be, I think they're an ERC20, but I need to double check actually, but there will be, you know, a smart contract on Ethereum. When you participate in the voyage, you will receive XP tokens, and it will be correlated with how much, you know, how much engagement and involvement you have with the protocol, you know. And we're also exploring like crypto native ways to try and reduce the amount of like bots and sybils as well to make it really fair on the community. So we've released basically a better version of Ethereum attestation service, so the EAS. We just released something called Verax, and we're going to be leveraging that. And that's all going to be based around building up a really good community of Voyage XP tokens and Voyage XP users. The gas, by the way, so we go back to this sort of like EVM equivalence. So the token, the currency or the gas that you pay to execute a transaction on Linea is just ETH. It's just Ether. So you actually don't need to get a new token. Like you can just bridge your Ether. It's exactly the same. It works exactly the same. So in terms of that part, you know, just get ETH and deploy to Linea.
Perfect. I think most people here have some spare ETH, so we should be able to pay the gas and get over there. Awesome. Chris, I know you had a question. I think that I asked it appropriately, but we've got, you know, maybe a minute left. So if I missed anything, Chris, do you have a question? No?
No, I think Declan, you did answer it, because my question was, you know, you mentioned things like you know, shared state and whatnot, but just I was thinking specifically about Eclipse, that the new blockchain that is, you know, modular, utilizes, you know, EVM parts, but uses, you know, Solana for the virtual machine. So just wondering if you know, using the ZK proving technology, if that could be something that could possibly be weaved you know, into this multi-prover technology, you know, weaved into modular blockchains, or you know, something interesting like boutique. Obviously, the one thing we're looking at with this new bull market is probably a lot of institutions coming down, wanting these controls, wanting the ability to have that, you know, assured security, which I think a lot of what you're talking about could definitely play to.
Yeah, the interesting thing about the modular narrative is there's a little bit of it's a little bit of marketing, right? Like if you actually look in the code of many of the chains, like it's like what does modular mean? Like Linea is as modular as any of these other chains. Like we can swap out the data availability of Ethereum to an eigenDA or Celestia. Like now we don't want to do that because we think that full Ethereum security is going to serve our customers. But the actual software that we're building on, which is going to be open source, like people could take that and then you could deploy like a new rollup using the Linea prover, but like using Celestia, as you mentioned. So I think like every chain is almost like modular from that perspective, but actually when you look into it, it's like not, yeah, it's not always as easy as you think to like swap bits in and out.
Yeah, I think when you mentioned equivalence, that that's a major thing, because you can literally take the bytecode that you've already compiled and just run it into Linea system and be perfectly fine. So
yeah, 100%. Yeah, and like in the future as well, when we can eventually like prove Ethereum blocks directly, so like start to enshrine the ZK EVM, the Linea ZK EVM in Ethereum, like that's a sort of like long-term goal. Yeah, that's like a really great place to be for the greater Ethereum ecosystem and all the rollups that live on top of it as well. It's almost like a tree of life.
So I know we're at time, but do you have 5 or 10 extra minutes to talk about that? And like, what does the Linea prover look like now? And then how we're viewing it long-term in this concept of protocol enshrinement?
Yeah, I got 5 minutes. So how it works today, so one taxonomy that has been given to ZK EVMs was by Vitalik himself, right? So there's like different types, type 1, type 2, type 3, type 4. So like an EVM equivalent ZK EVM is actually a type 2, okay? And what a type 2 is that as far as the developer is concerned, everything looks like Ethereum. It's the same compiler, it's the same JSON RPC interface. But the difference is the way that the state is structured. So Ethereum uses what we call like a Merkle-Patricia tree. It uses a hash function called Ketchak. These were never really like built to be used in a zero-knowledge circuit. They're like not very zero-knowledge circuit friendly. So what ZK rollups do is that they actually change the state structure and they use a different hash function that's like more optimal for ZK. And it's a sort of an intermediary step where like you still, as a developer, get the same experience, but you can't actually use these systems to prove Ethereum directly, right? Because Ethereum has like a different view of how like blocks are like connected together in this long tree. And so in order for Linea to eventually be enshrined in the layer 1, it would need to move from a type 2 to a type 1. And that basically means just the way we represent the state and the hash function needs to be the same. Now, what's actually probably going to happen is there's going to be like a meeting of both sides. Like the Ethereum protocol is going to upgrade to be more ZK friendly and more rollup friendly, and the rollups are going to kind of meet to like match together. And then what it means is that we can just reuse these systems across layers, across different EVMs, to have that standardization. So yeah, that's the expected path from where we are today to where we need to get to. But type 2 is like more than good enough for what we have today in the developer experience. It's just that obviously improving Ethereum directly is like a nice, long-term goal that we should keep in mind.
Definitely a multi-year time horizon on that one, huh?
Yeah, we don't want to mess around with the layer 1, So like, everything takes a lot of time. We have layer 2, we can prove these systems work over like, a few years, when they were working and they're securing billions of dollars and transactions, then it's probably time to start thinking about like enshrining them into the layer 1 itself. But, slowly does it. This is a long-term game we're building for, so.
Awesome. Well, we appreciate you and Linea and Consensys for everything y'all are doing to contribute towards this long-term game of scaling Ethereum and secure decentralized block space. Thanks for hanging out with us. It was great talking to you, and yeah, what an awesome time. Everybody,
yeah, thank you so much for hosting me. Here's the link to our website as well if you want to check it out.
Yeah, anything you want to plug, linea.build and the voyage, anything else, feel free.
Yeah, linea.build, there's some information there about the voyage. It's Linea build on like every single social as well. So if you want to like, just follow for updates and stay tuned, then I recommend, just jumping on one of the social channels. Yeah, so on the Linea build, hang on. So ecosystem apps. Okay, this is going to be really helpful. So here are all of the applications that we know about that are live on mainnet, because obviously anyone can deploy. But here are the partners that have reached out to us to be added on. There's, I think, like nearly 300 now or something. And you can filter by DeFi or filter by any label you like. Of course, do your own research when using them because they are third-party apps at the same time. But yeah.
Perfect. Awesome. NFA, DYOR, check out the application ecosystem. I'm sure, DeFi Llama also probably does a decent job of staying up to date as well on the application ecosystem, and Linea Voyage for DeFi users at the end of this month. Thank you so much, Declan. It was awesome talking to you, and I hope that we can have you back at some point in the future.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Take it easy.
Ciao.